A new look at addiction. Addiction is surrounded by pain. Behind every raw and violent act, there is a story rooted in them of agony and degradation. The social ostracism that these addicts face certainly do not help. It is as if society has created an invisible barbed wire around addicts, pushing them away and shaming them, as if they do not belong in our society. There is a world beyond them, but we have made that world inaccessible and unattainable, as society fears and rejects them. In this presentation, I will be exploring my essential question of what factors into addiction. I hope to open your minds to a new way of looking at addiction. I aim to give you a new, more compassionate way of understanding addiction instead of seeing it as a personal choice and failure. Not illness or the fear of dying, loss of relationships, or love will sway addicts from the habit. But how do we understand this overwhelming power of drug addiction? What keeps the woman living on the street to keep shooting cocaine despite repeatedly going to the hospital for her joint infections? The truth of the matter is, humans do not quit a habit just because they have had a negative consequence or experience. If this were the truth, TV rooms would be empty and fast food restaurants would go bankrupt. Drugs and alcohol have the power to make you forget. They make the painful tolerable. People use it as an emotional anesthetic, a tonic against fatigue and boredom, to help cope with a personal sense of inadequacy, to help fill voids, as a stress reliever. The list goes on, and the reason is different for everyone. But at the end of the day, there's one main goal that is strewn across addicts. They want to escape their own reality. Addiction is rooted in pain. Sometimes hidden in the unconscious or out in the open, these drugs are essentially emotional and physical anesthetics. There was a study shown that the most hardcore substance users come from abusive homes, showing why addicts desperately crave relief. It is said that almost all women and some men addicts that are living in downtown east side of Vancouver were sexually abused in their childhood. Residents of this area in Vancouver tell stories of pain upon pain, beatings, rejection, abandonment, humiliation, etc. Many of these addicts today were obliged to take care of themselves as they saw horrific things no children should ever see or experience: violent relationships, self-harm, and suicide attempts, just to name a few. Although this is not the case for all addicts, not all addictions are rooted in trauma and abuse. Although there is pain centered in all addictive behaviors, it is existent in the internet addict and the compulsive shopper and the drug addict. Some aches may not be as excruciating and some wounds not as deep as the other. Some pain may even be hidden and unconscious, but it is present in every addict. The topic of addiction is intriguing, and there were so many reliable sources that I was able to find: books, websites, articles, YouTube videos, etc. But I wanted to find the most authentic source possible, someone who has come face to face with this brutal disease, a recovering alcoholic. He prefers to be anonymous, so we'll call him John. I asked him about what he thought was the most effective way to get over addiction. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer to overcoming addiction. However, there is a lot of help out there for addicts who are ready or forced for health, family, or employment reasons to get well, John says. Reaching out to those services and asking for help, in my opinion, is the most effective way to begin the process of recovering from addiction. Trying to beat addiction alone is not only rarely successful, but often ends in tragedy. When speaking about why he thinks people turn to drugs and alcohol in the first place, John says, "No one who has ever seen a drug addict eating the scabs off his arm in the hope of getting high, prostitutes male and female selling their bodies for drugs, or the alcoholic dying painfully from cirrhosis of the liver could possibly think using alcohol or drugs is in any way attractive. In fact, seeing those things, one would think using any of these substances would be the most repellent of choices one could make. So then you've asked why. Who has convinced us that drugs and alcohol, gambling, and promiscuity are okay, even fun, or at the very least harmless? Who? I have my ideas. However, it's so important that your generation grapple with and answer this question, and I will leave it with you. I have every confidence that you will solve this problem and in the process save lives, including perhaps the person sitting right next to you in class," John states. He then goes on to speak about his experience with recovery and not ever using again. I believe that once addicts have come to understand the reasons why he or she has come to the place of addiction, and truly examined what has led to that point, a real sense of freedom is experienced. Addiction is almost always a symptom of a larger underlying issues in a person's life. Getting to the heart of those issues, fear, insecurity, abuse, neglect, pride, loneliness, among others, is a difficult part. Former addicts, like everyone, will have trials and hardships in life. Once recovered, they will have to learn to choose, like most everyone else, to accept those troubles without turning to harmful and ineffective remedies. John ends the interview with this insightful thought. We all think we know what an addict is. Over the past 100 years, the definition of addiction has changed. Centuries before now, Shakespeare defined addiction simply as an activity someone is passionate about or gave one's time to. Now it is more commonly referred to as a dysfunctional dependence on drugs or on behaviors such as gambling or sex or eating. Some may classify it as a disease. In Gabor Mate's book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, he defines addiction as any repeated behavior, substance-related or not, in which a person feels compelled to persist regardless of its negative impact on his life and the lives of others. It includes loss of control over the behavior and intense craving for the substance or activity when it is not around. All addictions, substance-related or not, have the same brain circuit and chemicals. This meaning addiction is not only a psychological or emotional issue, but also a biological issue. It is a complex. There is no definite and one-size-fits-all answer when talking about this condition. It is an intricate interaction between human beings and their environment. You must look at addiction from all its different points and realize that there are biological factors, chemical, neurological, psychological, emotional, medical, social, political, and spiritual factors that go into it. While some people may view addiction as a disease, that narrows it down to a medical standpoint, when really there are so many more things that go into it. Although it does have some characteristics of a disease, it must be looked at from all other angles too. A common misconception that has been addressed a lot in the public discussion surrounding addiction is that drugs cause addiction. If this were true, we would not be safe offering narcotics to anyone, even if it was for medical reasons. There was a study shown that when opioids were prescribed for cancer pain, short-term and long-term, rarely did these drugs lead to addiction. Addiction is a human problem that resides in people, not in the drug or in the drug's capacity to produce physical effects, writes the teacher at Harvard Medical School Division on Addictions, Lance Dodds. By looking at only the actions of the chemicals for the source of addiction, we will not be able to fully understand addiction. Yes, it is possible for a patient to get addicted to a painkiller, but it is crucial to understand what about those individuals makes them vulnerable to addiction. A national survey in the U.S. found that the highest rate of dependence after any use was for tobacco. 32% of people who used nicotine went on to long-term use. For alcohol, marijuana, and cocaine, the rate is about 15%. The drug's physical effects are not the sole reason for addiction. If this were the case, everyone would be addicted after one use. Not to say that there aren't drugs that humans won't develop a fierce and compulsive craving for, there are, but this showing that addiction is not created solely by the access of the drug. In short, drugs do not turn all people into addicts, just like food does not turn anyone into a compulsive eater. Certain people are definitely more vulnerable to addiction than others. According to a recent brain search, this vulnerability to addiction does not come from your genetics, but it is actually rooted in your life experiences. In the 1980s, there was an ad for drug awareness. The ad showed a rat alone in a cage with two bottles, one with normal water and one with water laced with heroin and cocaine. All the rats that were in the environment became addicted and eventually died. But later on, a professor of psychology named Bruce Alexander realized something about this experiment. The rats were put in this cage, all alone, and had nothing to do but take the drugs. What would happen if they changed their environment? He filled the cage with the best rat food, colored balls and tunnels, the perfect environment for a rat. He also added the water laced with heroin and normal water. The rats tried from both bottles but did not become addicted to the drugged water. This was to show that rats with a good environment did not like the drugged water. There is a contradiction to saying that addiction is a disease. Environment and the cage that one lives in definitely plays a factor in your chances of becoming an addict. The psychologist decided he wanted to look more into this experiment. He took a rat and put it in isolation with the heroin. Then after the rat became addicted to the drugs, he put the rat in it with a nice cage. The rat suffered from some withdrawals from the drugs, but eventually went back to his normal self. The good cage saved him from dying. This experiment proved that emotional isolation, feeling of inadequacy, and the feeling of insignificance are the exact emotions that promote the neurobiology of addiction in a person. The brain of an addict and non-addict are drastically different. From an MRI study done in 2002, the brain of an addict showed signs of loss of learning capacity. The inability to acquire new information and adapt to new circumstances, and showed that they had less nerve cells than the regular brain. In a psychological test, the central and executive part of the brain, called the prefrontal cortex, was shown to be very low functioning. Stimulant-type drugs such as cocaine work because they increase the amount of dopamine available in central parts of the brain. Drugs increase the amount of dopamine in a part of your brain called the limbic reward system. Dopamine is a chemical that causes intense feelings of pleasure, which makes you want to use the drug again and again. The limbic reward system is the area of the brain that controls the emotions, like the pleasure of eating, drinking, and sex. Every single drug that is used to get high tickles this part of the brain, which is what makes it so addictive. Once this system of the brain is taken over, it hijacks all the other systems in your brain. The systems that drive judgment, planning, organization, memory, motivational, pretty much every system that allows you to function. When it comes to addiction, the dysfunctional brain must come to a choice and decide if it wants to overcome its own dysfunction. When the addiction is worse, the greater the obstacles the brain has to get through when opting for health. Scientific literature defines addiction as a chronic brain condition. This alone should be enough to discourage people from shaming and blaming the addict. When someone is suffering from something like Lyme's disease, which is also classified as a chronic brain condition, people never blame the sufferer. But everything changes when it comes to addiction. All of a sudden, it becomes a choice. But it is not. The addict's ability to choose is sometimes absent, and if not that, is definitely impaired. In order to move forward, one must break through the stone wall of seeing addiction as a disorder. The purpose of this is not to justify or to defend addiction, but to genuinely understand. I believe that if we look into this phenomenon with a clear and open mind, ready to learn, the sense of shame will be replaced with a sympathy and an appreciation of the complexity of addiction. Addicts use drugs and alcohol because they are afraid they can't bear the pain without them. Treating addicts with sympathy and tenderness allows the addicts to open their eyes to a world of compassion and non-judgmental curiosity toward themselves. Once addicts have accepted they need help, a lot of them turn to different forms of rehab, detox, etc. Some turn to the various 12-step programs or Alcoholics Anonymous. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable is the first step for AA and is repeated at every meeting. In order to heal, the internal beliefs and memories, mind states, emotions, and sentiments that are able to feed addictive behaviors, as well as the external factors, need to be addressed. In order to get to the root of this phenomena, we must look at where addiction starts: trauma and emotional loss. We must treat the trauma that then creates the addict. What we are doing hasn't worked. It's never going to work, and we need to change our whole approach. Tinkering around the edges isn't going to make a difference, says Alex Wodak. Addicts themselves, or society, tend to not make the connection between their past life experiences and their addiction. They blame themselves for something they cannot help, and therefore they are disconnected from their self-compassion. If there is one thing that I want you to learn from this presentation, it is to replace the harsh judgment on addicts with a curiosity of why they do what they do. Some do drugs, others go for a run, but at the end of the day, we're all searching for a tiny space, perhaps a hole, that gives us shelter from the terrible reality of the world. Thank you.